Hi everyone, welcome to the Strategy and Future. My name is Ridvan Bari Urcosta. Today together with me, Senior Fellow at the Strategy and Future, Nicholas Myers, and we are going to speak with Michael Kofman. He is a specialist on Russia. He serves as a director of the Russian Studies program at CNA and cooperates with Wilson Center, Kennan Institute, and War on the Rocks. Welcome to the Strategy and Future, Michael.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, my first question is going to be a general one because we speak a lot about Russia and Russia, but at the same time, we had the rare opportunity to speak with a real specialist on let's say, on Russia's strategy, military strategy, and so on. And what is the nature of Russian modern strategy? For instance, from one side, we could say that it's some kind of military art which Russia develops throughout centuries. It's Russian during the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and right now it's Russian Federation. So it was unbreakable process of military thinking. Oh, right now we have something new, something unique, which developed within last, let's say, 3 decades. What is it? Is it unique, or it's really some kind of continuation of old tradition?
Are you talking about the process of how military strategy is made, or are you talking about the actual military strategy that Russia has today?
First one, I mean, how it's made it. I mean, and actually maybe in both. From one side, how it works, and how in terms of the military thinking.
No, it's very much a continuation. I can give kind of a rough sense of the big inputs that go into military strategy. And it's important that listeners understand what military strategy is, because it's often confused for 2 other things. The first is political strategy or grand strategy, which is made by political leaders at the state level. Senior military officials have some input into that, but they do not set policy, right? So often when people talk about military strategy and then they say the Kremlin, they get it wrong. Military strategy is not set at the Kremlin. Policy is set at the Kremlin, and military strategy links military power to that policy, okay? But military strategy is made in another building. It's very large, but it's not the Kremlin. You can see it along the river in Moscow when you go past it, the Ministry of Defense. Military strategy is meant to link, in part, also operational art and operational design, you know, especially when you think about it in terms of conflict, to political ends, to political objectives. And military strategy typically reflects big choices on force structure, on force posture, where the forces are, on the kind of capabilities that you invest in, on your theory of war, right? And your understanding of your opponents. The big inputs that typically go into it are theoretical dialectic on the contemporary character of war and what matters. A look at modern capabilities, the sort of things that people fight with. A look at the contemporary operational concepts used by the major powers, and the sort of organizational structures that they develop to realize those operational concepts. There's a good degree of forecasting and thinking about the future of war, right? Where you're not just sort of reviewing past wars. They provide good insights on road posts. Military strategy is often backwards looking. You can always get insights from past wars, right? You can always look back to World War II, as Russian military strategy often does, or maybe even Napoleonic wars and historic debates. There are always recurring debates in it. One of the longest running historical debates you'll find in Russian military strategy is whether it's best to have a strategy based on annihilation or a strategy based on attrition. This debate has played out very much since the interwar period years of when the Soviet Union was formed between World War I and World War II. It's also played out since the Napoleonic War years too, and it continues to today. So this is a big question that endures. And strategy and doctrine are very tightly linked in Russia, in Russian military thought. It's a bit different often in the West. In the West, often doctrine is more a conversation about specific operational fights against specific opponents, right? How would you fight this adversary in this scenario? Let's say, how would you fight China over Taiwan? Whereas in Russia, doctrine is much more theoretical, and operational art is much more specific about how you fight. Anyway, I hope this provides maybe a brief overview or a sense of the topic.
So, in your opinion, it's because I was reading Frunze, I was reading some beginners. I mean, during the revolutionary period on the in the Soviet Russia. So it was really some kind of combination. They used this Clausewitz concept that the war is continuation of politics. Could we say that Russia is pursue such things right now? I mean, like, is it still part of Russian vision of, let's say, world and all threats which are coming from external world?
Maybe Nicholas take this on briefly. I don't want to hog all the airspace.
I mean, I can give my own opinions on it, but I think I'd be much more interested to hear to what extent do you perceive that the Russian military planning and exercise routine these days is directed at domestic enemies versus external ones? Because obviously the big theme that we're seeing emerging is this huge frustration with how the West is going to subvert all the internal contradictions within the Russian Federation, and that this becomes the new context for all of their major exercises. Whereas in the Soviet era, it was very much about interstate conflict and a perception that there was going to be a major crisis eventually on the international stage. Has this transformation actually really seeped into the whole transformation of the Russian military thinking about the world? Or is the Russian military much more externally focused than perhaps some of its propaganda would suggest these days?
Good question. So, first on Amira's question on just which you asked about Clausewitz. Clausewitz endured in Soviet military thought and Soviet political thought, but with some modifications, because Lenin actually made some very subtle modifications to his interpretations of what made sense with Clausewitz. And his view of that was that war was a continuation of policy to some extent, but through violent means. And there was a big difference between struggle, because the communist socialist struggle was not meant to be a violent one. In fact, if you remember, most of the thesis post-World War II of Soviet strategy postulated that peaceful coexistence is possible, that Soviet Union and most importantly communists would prevail without war, right? And so there was the difference between struggle versus armed struggle. And war was armed struggle, a violent struggle, which is different from the struggle that takes place during peaceful coexistence. All right. So it's important to remember that, yes, while Lenin very much liked Clausewitz when you read him, and he integrated a lot of Clausewitz in thought, and then this, of course, forced an internal dialectic in Soviet military thought. They had to make use of that. That's very true. Lenin also modified that, and the influences of Clausewitz, I would probably say long-term are overstated. I often dislike the conversation of, okay, Lenin read Clausewitz, then Soviet military thinkers had to speak to what Lenin wrote and liked, and then this continues all the way through Soviet military history, which it doesn't, and because there are many different periods in Soviet military history, right? And that this is relevant to today. Not really. Not so much. On the next great question, no, I think Russian military is very much externally focused. It is a military whose job is to procure conventional military capabilities and nuclear capabilities. It exercises and drills for different types of wars, different types of conflicts. Those wars fundamentally are kinetic in nature, and the Russian military is very kinetic in nature. That is, it primarily plans for conventional and nuclear war. It has paid considerable lip service to the threat perceptions of the national security establishment. And that's important, by the way. When national security elites, policymakers, Suwalki and what have you, say that there is a principal threat of political warfare, you expect to see the senior military leadership react to that. Now, they're going to react to that in two ways. First, they're going to take that on as a principal threat, and the narrative began to be that, look, there is such a thing as new type warfare. New type warfare is characterized by the use of potent non-military means as a preparatory phase, right, during a period of sustained confrontation. This can be considered to be a form of undeclared warfare, but it is not armed warfare, armed struggle, right, which is what the Russian military plans for. However, the recognition is that's very important, because before, the Russian military principally planned for just war, and a lot of these other instruments of confrontation are somebody else's problem, right? That's FSB's problem. That's SVR's and G problems, and so on, right? These are other people's problems. The military's problem is winning wars, right? So they started thinking much more about that and started writing about that. But they're mostly speaking about the threatened period of conflict, right? And the way, if you hear Gerasimov talk about it when he discusses, let's say, the supposed West Trojan horse strategy, the way they put this together is that the threat to Russia is first a sustained period of political warfare, active subversion, right? And mobilization of the Russian population against the state, which then would eventually be followed by an actual conventional intervention with high-end capabilities, right? And the sort of precision warfare driven by information, driven by long-range standoff precision guided weapons and the like. And the Russian military is really much more interested in the latter. They just have a very natural and logical problem, right? As any chief of general staff does. If the problem is political subversion and political warfare, all this, you need to explain why you receive 3% almost of GDP as your defense budget, and you're procuring tanks, submarines, and aircraft. How are you going to fight political warfare with all that? And a good chief of general staff will always intellectually link that problem with a solution that doesn't make much sense towards that problem, right? So that's what you see a lot in Russian writing, is that this is how the United States or the West supposedly fights. Great, very interesting. And the Russian military is deeply seized of this. However, they have a 1.5 trillion ruble procurement budget alone. That procurement budget is spent towards what? Combating political warfare? No, it's spent towards buying high-end conventional and nuclear capabilities, right? And it's ordered around 4 types of wars: armed conflict, local war, regional war, large-scale war. That's the construct. And at the back end of a nuclear war, which is a conversation on strategic nuclear exchange. That's a very short war. Where will you see in the Russian military doctrine the specific branch that talks about political war? Nowhere. Nowhere will you find it. It's not there, okay? You'll see many complaints about it, but there isn't a specific war type even isolated in any doctrinal documents that speaks to it.
Well, I suppose in a related sense then, what is Kartapolov's job in warfighting in that sense, with the new Zampolits reformed?
Or yeah, well, I think his warfighting days are over since he stopped being commander of Western Military District. I think his job in what is essentially a political directorate is to restore this degree of what's the best way to put it? It is to restore, I think, what the Russian military and what the political leadership wants to see as a substitute for what was the ideology in the political directorate that ensured loyalty to the ideology and sort of it being ingrained in the military leadership during the Soviet Union, right? And because the Russian state doesn't have a very good ideology, it has pillars like conservatism, maybe a liberalism and the like, a nationalism, things that form pillars of the national identity, right? They wanted to bring us back to the military. Why? Because they are worried that the military could be intellectually, psychologically affected by incredibly amazing Western information warfare, by US political subversion and the like, and that the military could be splintered from the population, turned against the regime, or that the military could be fragmented or demobilized, and so on and so forth. So this is a form of defense, psychological defense, and inoculation. And also an attempt to, of course, further ingrain loyalty within the military to the regime and to the ideas of the regime, right? So my sense of it is that one of the struggles the regime had for years was to create, a Russian national idea, and what would be the pillars of that idea, right? And you have a host of them, and they in a sense trying to rebuild the pieces that used to exist when the Soviet Union was there, but everyone stopped believing in the Soviet Union actually well before it collapsed, right? And for sure, and try to figure out what that looks like, because otherwise they feel pretty vulnerable, right? And they feel vulnerable to the notion that there could be a fifth column movement, both a fifth column movement that is anti-systemic opposition within Russia, but this could also exist within the military, right? The military, of course, represents Russia and Russians. It still conscripts soldiers. So your military will often represent your society. And that's a way to protect against these forms of political subversion, and what Russian military often discusses as either asymmetric tactics or indirect warfare.
But creation of this военный internet, military internet, is it part of this strategy, part of this discussion that creates some kind of secure zone for Russian militaries?
No, I thought they're just trying to create their own version of our SIPR, to be honest, which they didn't have for a long time. Their own classified internal network. And I think they still, I think at the most highest level, still do most things by paper in many ways, because paper is hard to hack. But whereas even classified networks are to various extents accessible. But I think it was their attempt to recreate a SIPR network. But to do that, you would need to have enough of your military really wired with command control communication systems. And the challenge with that is, for the classified network, at least, they'd have to be native, right? Because one of the biggest Russians' concern always been that if you buy something from, let's say, Cisco systems, and if that something is assembled in India or somewhere else, it will have components that are Western made, right? And then CIA will come and insert maybe one chip in there. And before you know, which CIA would never do, by the way. CIA or NSA would never do such a thing. Perish the thought. They would never do it. And neither would Chinese Huawei systems do the exact same thing. They would insert something in there hardwired into the system. And then before you know it, the entire network is compromised.
Another more procurement-centric question. To what extent do you perceive that artificial intelligence and robotics and these other new futuristic things that are now being talked about considerably more often in the Russian press, to what extent are they actually displacing tanks and artillery and other more traditional procurement objects in the budget so far? Or is this something that is still distant future concern?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's take on robotics. I think that right now in the Russian military, they're not displacing anything. They are fundamentally enablers for traditionally established forms and means of warfare and current operational art. They are huge enablers for artillery and for fires and strike systems to establish recon fire and recon strike, essentially loops, or what we would consider in the United States a kill chain, where you have sensors that can real time see targets, communicate this information to the actual weapon systems and shooters, and to be able to engage things in real time and re-engage them. I think in robotics, autonomous systems, when it comes to unmanned or uncrewed or remotely operated aviation, they were pretty far behind and trying to catch up. And here you basically have the opportunity, at least for UCAVs, once they get them, these will be armed UAS drones, that they could to some extent, because they're cheap, they have tremendous loiter time, you can lose them, they're essentially expendable, replace parts of tactical aviation helicopters. But part of the reason they were behind is because they initially in the procurement program went in the opposite direction. When drones were proposed, head of Air Force and other people said, look, there's plenty of pilots for aircraft and helicopters. We don't modernize aircraft and helicopters. Procure those first. So the Russian military went on a massive procurement spree for combat rotary aviation, helicopters, and modernizing tactical aviation. And they spent all the time and money on that. And so in many ways, they missed out on the proliferation and advancements in drones. And now they're playing catch up. Same thing with loitering munitions and drone swarms and all that. They're heavily invested in ground vehicles, robotics, but those basically show themselves to be fairly limited systems. There's opportunity for what we call man-machine teaming, but the truth is that you can have what they call robotized complexes. They're not going to replace tanks. I don't think they're going to replace tanks anytime soon. And because here's the truth. And an automated system can replace a gunner in any weapon system pretty easily. In fact, it can often be a better gunner. It can, to some extent, replace a commander or displace him and make the commander operate the system remotely. But it's very hard to replace a driver. Good luck replacing the tank driver, all right? And having that vehicle be able to drive itself. Or if you think you can drive a tank, because most of the challenge with a tank is actually seeing around yourself, right, and driving it. And most of the driving you do is actually outside the tank, not with the scopes and imaging systems internally, because when you're buttoned up, you can see very little. You have very little situational awareness, okay? So if you think with a couple cameras, you're gonna drive this tank nearly as effectively, I know Israelis have versions where they're working on it. I'm just telling you that it's not gonna work nearly as well. So short end on that, I think automated systems have a long way to go. AI, so working quite a bit on AI was, AI is not military technology. AI is an industrial revolution type technology. It's like the railroad or the steam engine, other things. So it will fundamentally transform parts of how society does business, and it'll naturally have an effect on military technology and military operations. And that effect is, not being debated. As always, you have two debates. Like you have traditionalists and you have revolutionaries. Traditionalists say that war will stay the same as it was, but AI will make it better, more lethal, what have you, right? So it'll be the existing weapon systems plus AI. And you have revolutionaries. Revolutionaries say, no, once we have AI, it'll change everything, and then everything will be different. And then they'll debate with each other for a while. And that's a good dialectic, actually. That's actually a great classical dialectic of how doctrine evolves in the Russian military. And people discuss the idea of negation, whether this thing is now negating the other thing. And they put two ideas next to each other, and they see which of those ideas intellectually makes better sense, right? There's a discourse that takes place. And they see which, and there's an understanding that you always have a relationship between quantity and quality. And you always have a relationship between one technology eventually countering another technology, and so on and so forth. And as the debates, these are kind of the discourses that take place. My current sense on AI is that AI, as it's conceived of, is very limited. And it's right now, it is helping make incredibly advanced and complicated systems work together. Integrated air defense, electronic warfare, and the like, where what the person is doing now, the person who's operating the system, is they are not making a lot of the individual decisions. They are setting the system to run in specific modes. And the system is doing the data processing on its own. And it is making a lot of the lesser decisions by itself. The kind of things that an operator in 1980s would be turning switches and doing this, that themselves. Now there's just one switch for the mode, and the system is doing that, and the operator is making some high-level choices. But because the speed of warfare just at the tactical level is too fast, you can no longer have a person making all these decisions in real time. The machine has to make a lot of them because it can do them much faster.
About, you already said that, actually I wanted to ask before, such question was in the list of mine, regarding why actually Russia failed to predict that drone revolution is going to to come soon. I mean, like, yes, they had drone programs from the beginning of the 2000s, I would say. Even the Охотник, this huge drone, actually, it was built as a project already during the Soviet Union times. But they had Idlib. So it was really interesting war theater where they could learn what is it, new type of warfare, drone warfare. Now we have a Karabakh. But do you think Russia learned something from these two wars, or these two war theaters, drone war theaters? Even we could include here Libya as well.
Yeah. Well, I think in fairness to Russian military, I don't think they failed to predict it. There was a lot written about it in the 90s too, right? That the next generation of warfare that would follow would be heavily leveraging autonomous systems and robotic or robotized complexes and the like. They failed to execute in part on the programs they had. And some people who are smart said, hey, let's just buy Israeli older searcher drones and do a licensed production run of those, while our own industry keeps promising to, build these drones, and it's not going to get there. Part of the reason they failed to execute is the supporting industries that would be required for manufacturing of drones weren't there. For example, light engine aircraft production. So for light aircraft, the engine production simply wasn't there. That's one example. And that even in cases where they were working on prototypes, it became clear that the organizations, the companies working on them could not serially produce them. And this is an eternal problem in modern Russian military technology. Problem is not research and development, the problem is serial production. Serial production is a weakness. And the problem is never limitation of funding in the defense budget. And people who write that are, I'll be frank, wrong. Very wrong for a very long time. The problem is not a limitation of resources. The industry cannot execute the funding. It cannot serially produce a lot of the equipment, right? For a whole host of reasons, and you see this crop up. But what you get is you get bottlenecks, where all it takes is for everyone to be able to make the key parts of a system that you're developing, but for one organization to not be able to make one critical component, all right? And then you don't have the system. All it takes for one person to not be able to make an engine, right? Or for one person not be able to make another key component of it. And for years, you just don't have a working system. When you look at the contemporary conflicts, I can probably summarize what they learned from the Nagorno-Karabakh war and from conflicts in Syria and Libya. The lessons are not really specific from that conflict, but more towards the direction of kind of warfare in the future and what this will mean for a much larger fight with an opponent like the United States. So Turkish UCAVs, right, combat armed drones that they use are not really a concern, and their performance is grossly overstated. There's nothing particularly fascinating or interesting about how their drones were able to take on very limited and sparsely deployed air defense systems from late 60s and 1970s. They had no capacity to engage them. Okay, this is a no-brainer. What evolution of drone aviation really speaks to is, first, of course, that you have smaller and middle powers being able to gain the benefit of aviation, and aviation together with precision-guided weapons and the like, which used to be the luxury of much larger powers, right? Manned aviation is very expensive. Very few countries have anything to speak of in terms of modern or contemporary tactical aviation. Second, drones are different than aircraft and helicopters. They are losable, and they often are able to destroy things more expensive than themselves. That means that you can successfully engage in wars of attrition, fairly high attrition early on. It favors attrition strategies. You're not going to trade very expensive aircraft for one air defense system. That's a bad trade. Plus, there's a person in it too. But the cost doesn't make any sense, right? But you can definitely trade drones. The challenge the Russian military saw in it was first actually loitering munitions, right? This is the ability to use with fairly high density, large numbers, loitering munitions that are essentially small suicide drones. They're hard to detect for radar because they're very small, and they basically commit suicide and kill whatever vehicle or target they aim at, and they can operate autonomously. Okay, much larger combat uncrewed aviation, that requires command signal links. It requires people to operate from the ground, and those can be targeted and taken out ultimately. There are a lot of challenges with that. And the truth is that Russian air defense has no problem destroying these UCAVs. If you see in Libya, Turkey lost over 20 alone last year, right? The basic panzer air defense. In fact, Turkish losses of these systems are quite high across these conflicts. That's the truth. Turkey has a great PR campaign, and visually they post tremendous amount of video footage, most of which is real, of how their systems are able to take out, let's say, things in Libya or Syria, and especially in this second Nagorno-Karabakh war. But if you look at the footage, actually a lot of things are not necessarily being taken out by their drone to begin with. And you see a lot of things that are being taken out, but it's a really complex set of tactics between different drones operating at different altitudes and layers. So it's sort of more pretty sophisticated approach where you have high altitude standoff drones, you have medium altitude drones, you have small drones doing targeting, you have loitering munitions operating in there as well. The biggest challenge for the Russian military is really drone swarms, and the fact that very likely in a mass airspace strike or attack in a hypothetical conflict between Russia and NATO, the initial layer echelon that looks to penetrate and destroy Russian integrated air defense will not be advanced manned aviation, but will be aviation systems delivering drones and drone swarms, which will saturate air defense, right, and essentially be able to destroy a substantial part of this integrated air defense before actual manned aviation shows up. Right? I hope this makes sense. And that's their concern, is that if you look at the success in some ways of Russia's modernization program, it's done a pretty good job of deploying and modernizing a lot of the long-range integrated air defense complexes. It's done a decent job of upgrading some of the ground force air defense, but they had some big gaps, specifically in systems like S-350 and modernizing, I would say, much more tactical air defense that's assigned to the ground forces. Because what these conflicts show is that a lot of the air defense that ground forces have today is in some ways obsolete. Either it cannot shoot at range, it cannot engage at range, modern uncrewed systems, or it doesn't have the radar capability to effectively engage these other types of drones. It's just too obsolete. That's issue one. And long-range integrated air defense can be too easily saturated. That's problem two. These are the two ways these are the two takeaways that I would put. And actually their takeaways, I think, are quite right. And they understand the problem, right? And they're quite right that in a mass airspace attack, there'll be a tremendous use of decoys, various types of drones and self-organizing drone swarms. And yes, that aircraft would launch large, think of them maybe as missiles or delivery vehicles, and those missiles would actually deliver drones, self-organizing drone swarms and the like. And that is the direction of the future. We're not here today, but it's very likely the path in the future, and you see a lot of these systems in development. So yeah, they're quite understanding that the lessons from these wars is that there is a technology afoot that will negate their investment in integrated air defense, which was designed to negate Western tremendous air superiority. That would be the best way dialectically, as I would put it.
So obviously, Strategy and Future is mostly focused on Polish security. So I think I'll turn briefly over to the Western strategic theater specific question. Now, I know you and I agree on this, but I want to tee you up to have as much fun with this question as you want. Obviously, the order of battle bulk out is finally coming to Kaliningrad Oblast a bit later than everybody back in 2014, 2015 was predicting. Not you, obviously, but Let's put it as bluntly as possible. Kaliningrad Oblast, a position to defend or a position from which to mount an attack on the Suwalki corridor, Poland, or anywhere else. Have as much fun with that as you want.
Sure. Well, so if we look at terms of operational art, Russian military thinking really does not have a discrete defensive or offensive operational concepts anymore. They are both. And very few military capabilities lend themselves specifically to defense or offense. They can do both, and they are viable and effective in defensive or offensive operations. So the answer to all that is yes. And it's very hard. Defensive and offensive today are more often than not political characterizations. If anything, they're or people say an exercise is aggressive or not aggressive. This is often the way ambassadors talk about things, but that's not the way military analysts should talk about things. So what you basically find is that, yes, while operationally the force can do both, right, depending on the scenario, realistically, though, the units in Kaliningrad, the 11th Army Corps, and the units that are being combined into what looks like a motor rifle division, by all accounts, that those units are meant to be pinning force, and that what they are likely there to do is to defend and then to be able to interdict. Because here's the thing. A lot of Russian writing in terms of operational art speaks to the fact that the engagements at tactical level will be nonlinear, that you're not going to have armies deploying holding lines on a battlefield like you were in World War I, World War II, and so on. That most of your warfare will be non-contact. This means you're not going to have a tank directly seeing another tank at, let's say, 2-3 kilometers. There'll be exchanges with recon fire, recon strike complexes. That is, all of your fighting is going to be standoff. You're going to have the sensors to be able to see each other and to engage each other with fires and with strike systems at considerable range. It's going to be very hard for a soldier to get within sight range of another soldier to actually shoot him, right? So with that in mind, the Russian military's thinking was that artillery and strike systems will be used not just traditionally the way Russian military used them. And for those who don't know, the Russian military is not an armored force. It's an artillery army with lots of tanks. It always had been an artillery army in terms of its combined arms orientation, right? You're never going to compete with Russian military in terms of number of artillery. You can compete with quality and precision and other things. But if you're talking about quantity of artillery assigned, support units to maneuver units, you're not going to compete in artillery and air defense. The ratio of that in any Russian ground force unit is very high for a reason. You often find more tanks than artillery, okay, assigned to maneuver units. So that these that fires can be used not only to enable maneuver, but to deny maneuver to opponent and to essentially block zones. And so what you're likely going to see is the interdiction of the Suwalki Gap by forces that are not in the Suwalki Gap because they don't need to be there at all. They can sit and defend in well-prepared positions in Kaliningrad, and they can interdict access through the corridor because it's 2021, it's not 1921, and that's an important thing to communicate to people, right? They do not physically have to be there to see and engage targets there. They can deploy strikes, they can deploy fires, they can deploy minefields at range. They can do all sorts of things at reasonable ranges, yes. And they can interdict that area with some efficacy. Okay, so when we get to the defensive and offensive, yeah, I personally just don't see a lot of the rationale for the Suwalki Gap or Suwalki corridor narrative. In fact, that's just even parts of the geography don't make sense in terms of physically deploying forces to interdict it. Tactically, it's not very sound. The other part of it is that when you look at the scenarios that lead to it, I have an article about this, kind of looking at FATECON, please, and the rationale behind them from last fall. The operational scenarios don't match the political intent or the objectives. That's the biggest problem in Western thinking and looking at these. You can basically, the desired political ends, what we presume Russia may seek to accomplish, okay, it doesn't make sense that military operation would be structured in that place, in that area, or in that way to accomplish those political ends, or vice versa. So generally, scenario planning has this big mismatch.
I just have a maybe primitive question, but if we have within last 5, assume, or from the 2014, several, maybe even more than several international conflicts, Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, Libya, Syria. And if we assume, just assume like that conflict is going to be here in Baltic region, near Poland, what kind of shape it's going to take? What kind of level? So it's directly would be NATO-Russia conflict, or it's going to be local conflict or something like that? Could we speak about?
Sure. So, okay, the honest answer is that I don't know why we assume that conflict will take place in the Baltics or Poland, but for the sake of assumptions, because military establishments have to plan off of capability. They can't plan off of intent, because you can't always predict intent, but most importantly, intentions can change, capabilities remain there, right? So you have to plan often off of worst case scenarios. That said, you also have to choose your scenarios. If you choose wrongly, you will make pretty serious mistakes in military strategy. And strategy is about choices, right? Strategy is about making choices and choosing not to do certain things. So you have to invest wisely, force posture, force structure, capability, readiness, and the like. This is one of my biggest challenges with current scenario planning. Many of the scenarios don't make sense. And many of us who have to play out these scenarios, whether in wargaming or people on the intelligence side, don't think they make a lot of sense necessarily either, right? They are warfighting constructs that aren't logical, but we can put that aside. So the question is, let's assume there's a conflict. Where the conflict takes place and how it unfolds depends entirely on the causes of the conflict, right? The causes of war are in some cases a bit predictable. Most wars are caused by what, right? The cause of war are political. That's one. First, they are not military. This is important. A lot of people think that wars can be caused by military incidents. That's not true. Military incidents are used by countries who want to go to war. Countries that don't want to go to war are never going to go to war because of a military incident or an exercise gone wrong. It just hasn't happened, okay? That's why it never happened during the Cold War II. Even during the worst case, 1983 Able Archer scare, which is highly debated by historians, the extent to which that was a scare. But point being is cause of war, not military incidents. Military planners, defense planners think they could be, but they don't make any decisions on war. So oftentimes you have a community talking about cause of war where they will never be the ones to decide. Political leaders decide to go to war, not military planners. No matter how many stars you see a general have, he will never be the person making the decision to go to war, okay? And the person who will choose to go to war is gonna have a very different mindset than him because he didn't have 30 years in the military. The things he's thinking about, right, are not the same things, right? He may think about domestic politics. He may think about regime stability. He may think about legacy. He may think about the country's honor. He may think about all sorts of things, right? And he's thinking about costs, but the things driving their calculations, right? Maybe calculating the political resolve of the other states and so on. But the military balance and tactical things don't play in that much into political decision-making on war. Defense planners think they do, but they don't. Military, just to be clear, political leaders usually don't know anything about tactical capabilities or matchups between forces. And usually the things that they do know are absolutely wrong. And all you need to do is give them an opportunity to explain to you what they think the military balance is and how they think things might work at the operational tactical level for you to be rapidly convinced that they have no idea what they're talking about, all right? And so do not assume at all that anything you will say about forces and capabilities will be impressive to them, or that this is why they will choose to invade or not invade somebody. Just to be clear, Hitler didn't invade Europe because he was a deep expert on tanks and thought tanks were amazing. And we actually have the archives to prove it. Right? So yeah, we do. We have a lot of history. Nobody went to war because of specific faith in mil capabilities. Sorry, it's a bit, I went on a tangent. The answer to your question on causes, so if we look at fait accomplis, These are gambits based on political resolve, non-military balance. So they assume that there's an area of low political value to the other side that can be easily grabbed, and that the other side won't fight for it ultimately. Okay, won't counter-escalate. Typically, you find these fights, they're very common. They're the most common form of territorial acquisition post-World War II. They're usually small parts of states. They are parts that are not densely populated, not very high value. They're bordering parts of state, because if you seize them, they have to be along your borders. You're attaching them to something that you already belongs to you, okay? Or they're uninhabited, or they're islands and things like that. So you find a lot of these fights in actually poor terrain, mountains, glaciers, the like, or islands. In this regard, Crimea is a bit of an outlier because of how large it is, but it's a fairly typical fait accompli, where you seize a part of a state, a part you can easily isolate, and a part that you seize believing that they will not fight for it, okay? And there are different reasons why they might not fight for it. They might not fight for it because it's not sufficiently valuable to them, or because you're much stronger than them. It is a strategy of both the weak and the strong. Much weaker states do it, and much stronger states do it. So it's not a strategy depending at all on the military balance. Even if you're much militarily stronger than your opponent, fait accomplis actually become more lucrative to them rather than less. Because fait accompli is a strategy to avoid a bigger fight. The whole idea is, how do I make gains without getting myself into a bigger, longer fight? Right. So if you look at where a fait accompli is likely, well, the last place it's likely in the Suwalki Gap, to be honest. How you even get there? Where do you attach that to? Right. And the seizure of whole states is not a fait accompli, just to be clear. A Russian invasion of the Baltics not only is not a fait accompli, it's a total war for those states. It will be the largest case of territorial acquisition and aggression, okay, post-World War II. Actually, period. Not just in Europe, realistically. The conquest of 3 states. In Europe, the conquest of even 1 state will be pretty big. And you have the same story with Belarus. Belarus is larger and more populous than all Baltic states combined. So these are a bit unrealistic. These are basically total war scenarios. Russia conquers the entire state. And the Suwalki Gap is ultimately a 1.5 state scenario, where the only way you would even get there, really, is if Russia took a part of Belarus, right, or all of Belarus, right, and then a chunk of Lithuania as well to connect these dots, realistically. Because you're imagining Russian forces deploying there and then occupying this terrain, because then they can't leave, because you assume it'll be contested. So
but you said Lithuania. You said part of Lithuania, not Poland. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yes.
Why? Because
operationally, it makes a lot more sense. Yeah, operationally, it makes a lot more sense that way. I mean, I don't have a map in front of me. If I had a map, I can point to it and say, trust me, it makes much more sense to do it that way. If you were going to do it, right? Not that I'm staying up at night thinking of ways to invade Lithuania or Poland. I just want to be clear, okay? But I've often led, I've often done this sort of thing intellectually, and it just makes more sense that way. So one of the challenges, the question is why? Why would you even do that? What would be the political cause of that conflict, right? The only logical cause of that war is actually a very proximate one that we should discuss, which is a political crisis in Belarus that leads to a potential involvement of the countries around Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and the like, okay? The Russian military planning for Zapad exercise, which is coming up, and this will be close and dear to Nick's heart, because I follow the military exercise and so does he. The scenario for that is typically on the Russian end. A, intervention by a coalition of NATO states, typically led by Poland and Lithuania, into Belarus. A Russian counter-intervention into Belarus, okay, which typically plays out first as a mobile or maneuvered defense, and then a counteroffensive. And that counteroffensive drives itself all the way up to Belarus's borders, but it can drive itself all the way to interdicting, basically, ground lines of communication for NATO states between Poland and Lithuania. All right. So this, from their point of view, this is their, think of it, this is their hind fight. This is their version of it, right? And the way you could get this fight, of course, is actually if all the parties involved, this is the scary scenario, because this is more realistically how wars start. Like military opportunity, territorial conquest to opportunism is pretty rare. And when it does happen, it's usually this kind of seizure of a small piece of territory that's by your borders. So if you're going to have a fait accompli from Russia, you'll get that 20 feet into Estonia. That's where you would do it, right? Or maybe Narva or something like that. That's what a fait accompli looks like. Or some uninhabited, low-value island that Russians have seized, and now are you really going to go to war with Russia over that? That's your likely scenario, okay? But a real regional war, the way Russian military terms it, would likely start actually from all sides taking potentially logical steps to secure their interests and to deter the other side, right? And all sides potentially getting involved in deploying forces either in Belarus or around Belarus, which then triggers an action-reaction mechanism. Whereas, you know, I know, Mary, you're a political scientist. It's a spiral decision-making model where all sides making fairly logical choices trying to avoid war act in such a way so as to engender a spiral of decisions, right, which eventually leads to the conflict, a conflict that the sides wanted to avoid. Because nobody is sure of the other side's intentions, right? And in an adversarial relationship, you're just unsure of the ultimate intentions of your opponent. So you're going to take steps to deter them and to ensure your security. You're going to deploy forces. And then eventually mistakes can be made in this regard, right? Misjudgments are made about the intentions of the other side because rationality is bounded. You're working with limited information and you're now working under time pressure because you're not sure what the other side intends to do. So maybe you think they're going to intervene, so you intervene instead. And then they intervene because you intervene. And then eventually your forces come into contact.
Michael, but for instance, sorry, Nicholas, I just short question. But Filda gap, which existed during the Cold War, it was one of one of the biggest concentration of forces from both sides. Mm-hmm. But it's really work as a deterrence factor. So nobody was attacking each other. So everyone was happy. So maybe such situation is going to happen. For instance, just assume, for instance, concentration of forces in Suwalki Gap. I mean, NATO concentrating forces. Russia concentrating from the Belarusian side. And everybody happy, no?
I hate to disagree with you on your characterization. So two things about that. First, well, for much of the Cold War, not everybody was happy. This was a pretty tense and dangerous state of affairs, and there were some crises that really could have led to a war. Second, we should be very careful not to suffer what's called survivorship bias in analysis, right? Which is that just because we survived that type of what's called security dilemma and a sustained force bidding contest, I can look in other cases, right? And I can show you all the countries that didn't survive it, okay? For example, I could say, yes, we were happy, but sustained military confrontation and let's say a low-level war of attrition between Israel and Egypt in late 70s, late 60s, you had many cases of these standoffs where they actually do result in war. Force bidding contests and standoffs between other countries leads to these conflicts. You have fait accompli and counter fait accompli playing out right now between China and India for the last year and a half over Lac Glacier. That's a great example, actually, of exactly what these things look like and why these disputes take place. Now, you can say, again, with survivorship bias, well, but they haven't gone to war. My answer is not this time and not yet. But they have gone to conflict before, and so has China and the Soviet Union. I mean, like it can happen. So my argument is always yes, you can sustain forces deployed. You can sustain a degree of mutual vulnerability, which is the state we're going to live in. We're actually going to live in a state of mutual unhappiness, a degree of mutual vulnerability. I think NATO forces deployed in Baltics and Poland are a very effective deterrent against fait accomplis. Because once any reasonable amount of forces is encountered by the other side, the gambit that you will not have to fight those forces or those allies, which is a political gambit, goes out the window. It doesn't matter that they can be overrun. That's not the factor that counts, okay? The factor that counts is, are you going to have to fight them for it or not? Because if you are, then you create political resolve for the other side, right? So in many ways, the fait accompli gambit in most of the worst cases has already been solved for, and pretty effectively, actually. That is the right solution to it. Not in all cases. Like I raised, for example, Narva and Estonia for you, and if I ask you, what do NATO EFPs offer to that scenario? Actually, not much. To a lot of cases like that, not a lot. In terms of force buildups and things like that, the big difference that I suggest you consider is that force buildup in Fulda Gap was possible because Germany was a nice midpoint between NATO force in the United States and the Soviet Union. And so you can engender a much higher security dilemma further away from your borders. If you ask me, can you do that buildup in the exact same way a couple kilometers from St. Petersburg or between Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg? My answer to that is absolutely not. Do you think that any country, any power, wants to live in fear, perpetual fear? If you force states to live in a state of perpetual fear, they will often eventually run risks to change this military equation, okay? You will change their risk calculus because they do not want to live in fear, all right? So with the current balance of forces, I think it's fine. As long as both NATO and Russia do not get in a force bidding contest. That is, they do not start adding forces beyond what they really need for their security, and they accept a degree of mutual vulnerability. First, I don't think it's a good idea for NATO because we would lose that force bidding contest. It's much easier for Russia to rebase forces in this area than it is for the United States. And NATO countries, well, they talk really great at NATO summits, but if I ask how many brigades and divisions they're really going to provide to Poland and the Baltics, after a couple more, a little bit more, the answer is not much. If you ask Britain how many divisions they're going to send, the first question is, do they have divisions in plural? Is there really an S on the end of that word? You mean the division or a part of the division? What are they going to really send? So this is a serious question we have to ask, right? Why would you get into force bidding contest if you know that your allies are not going to supply you with those troops? I was being realistic and frank about it, that I think that's something we should avoid, both because it's bad, both because it'll lead to negative sum gain in security, and both because down the line, when we get there, the Russians are not going to run out of troops before we do, in troops we want to provide.
It's like my last question as we finish up here then, though, is based on your reading of the political interests in Moscow, to what extent does an antagonistic government in Ukraine stymie further Russian, let's say, aggressive-like actions in Europe? Not at all, or somewhat, or different regions?
So my view of it, Nick, this is a good question. My view of it is that the nature of the government in Ukraine doesn't matter that much. There is a baked-in local war planning scenario for the Russian military post-2014, and that is a war with Ukraine, presuming that at some point, some leadership in Ukraine may choose to retake the Donbass by force. That have required repositioning, as you know, of divisions, brigades, and the creation of an entire new combined arms army directly opposite Ukraine, which also coordinates sort of Russian forces in Ukraine and cycles them through on rotation. Because there's a standing contingency now in the books, those forces are going to be there and they're not going to leave and they're not going to move. All right. So to some extent, Ukraine is a driving factor, both in terms of Russian force structure and posture around itself. This is to include Crimea, right? So if we do kind of a complete half circle, put it that way, around Ukraine. And in some ways alleviated any potential much more serious, heavy Russian military deployment opposite Baltic states. Now, they may have done that themselves for prudent political reasons, but now you have this interesting balance because those forces can be moved towards Belarus or towards the Baltic state in a fight with NATO, but they're actually based quite far away in the Western military district, many of them, right? If this makes sense, right? So a lot of these forces, the force structure and the manpower and material that they sort of sucked in for the Ukrainian contingency, I hate to put it somewhat perhaps cynically, was actually, to me, quite useful for NATO. because with that contingency being on the books, it requires a fairly substantial Russian ground force to be present opposite eastern parts of Ukraine. In eastern parts of Ukraine, I know for a lot of people don't follow this region, so they think Western Military District is like not very big. That's not the case. It's actually a very, very, very large area. It's like 1,500 kilometers across plus. So Western Military District is can be about as far as the border of Estonia to back middle of France. Like it can be very far. So whenever people say something in Western Military District, my usual question is, why don't you tell me specifically where? Because it's a pretty large part of the world. You can fit most of Europe into the Western Military District. So because that contingency on the book, it doesn't matter what the leadership of Ukraine is. Not anymore. The force structure and posture decisions have been made. I don't see them being unmade in the near future. All right. And part of what drives that also is the Russian decision to deploy a relatively equal amount of operational size formations along each strategic direction. West, southwest, northwest, right? And if you kind of angle southwest as Southern Military District, looking down to the Caucasus, the Black Sea, and eastern parts of Ukraine, and Western Military District looking, well, obviously where it looks west, you get a decent sense of it. So you're likely going to have a distribution of forces that over time looks more equal than not, right? In terms of the different tactical unit formations that are in these districts.
It was realist thinker, Michael Kofman, really sober and realist thinker, and we have really many questions to you, and I hope someday you would agree again to speak with us. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to your program. Great talking to both of you today.